Perhaps the greatest deception of modern life is not that people fear being alone, but that they spend years convincing themselves they do. So they keep searching for someone to text, someone to love, someone to fill the silence that follows them wherever they go. Yet the silence never truly disappears. It waits patiently beneath the noise. And sooner or later, every person is confronted by a difficult truth. The longing for another person is not always love. Sometimes it is an attempt to escape the parts of ourselves we have never learned to face. The Stoics understood something that remains deeply uncomfortable even now. A person who cannot sit peacefully in their own company will eventually ask others to carry burdens they were never meant to carry. They will expect relationships to provide meaning, validation, certainty, and inner peace, things that can only be built from within. The more dependent we become on others to feel complete, the more fragile our freedom becomes. And that is where many people slowly lose themselves without ever realizing it. Most people assume the hardest part of being single is the absence of a partner, the empty chair across the table, the quiet apartment at night, the messages that never arrive. But those things are rarely the source of real discomfort. What unsettles people is something much closer. It is the moment when the distractions fall away and there is nothing left to focus on except their own thoughts. Because the greatest fear is often not being alone at all. It is finally meeting yourself in the silence and discovering there is nowhere left to hide. A person can spend years surrounded by conversations, entertainment, and constant activity without ever truly meeting themselves. Days become filled with responsibilities, obligations, and endless streams of information. Every quiet moment is quickly occupied. Every pause is interrupted. Then, one evening, the noise fades. The distractions fall away. The television is off. The messages stop. There is nothing demanding attention except the thoughts that have been waiting patiently in the background. And in that moment, silence feels heavier than expected. That reaction reveals something important. Human beings are remarkably skilled at staying busy. A free moment appears, and it is immediately filled. There is another video to watch, another notification to check, another conversation to start. None of these things are harmful on their own. The problem begins when constant stimulation becomes a way of avoiding reflection. Many people move from one distraction to another, not because they enjoy every moment of it, but because stillness asks something of them. It asks them to listen. The mind starts raising questions that have been postponed for months or even years. Questions about the direction of life. Questions about choices that were never fully examined. Questions about whether the goals being pursued truly belong to them. Instead of listening, many reach for something that will drown those questions out. The discomfort disappears for a while, but the questions remain. They wait beneath the surface, growing quieter perhaps, but never completely gone. And the longer they are ignored, the more unfamiliar a person becomes to themselves. This pattern often hides beneath ordinary routines. Someone may tell themselves they are simply staying productive, staying connected, or staying informed. On the surface, that explanation sounds reasonable. Yet productivity can become avoidance when it never leaves room for self-examination. Connection can become avoidance when it prevents a person from understanding their own inner world. Even information can become avoidance when it is consumed endlessly without reflection. The issue is not activity itself. The issue is the motive behind it. A person can fill every hour of the day and still feel an uncomfortable emptiness following them from one task to the next. That emptiness is frequently misunderstood. People assume it appears because something is missing from their lives. They search for a new achievement, a new experience, or a new relationship that might finally remove the feeling. For a short time, the feeling seems to disappear. Then it quietly returns. The reason is simple. Emptiness that comes from self-neglect cannot be solved by external additions. It asks for attention rather than distraction. It asks for honesty rather than escape. Yet honesty is difficult because it requires seeing parts of ourselves that do not always match the image we prefer to present to the world. The Stoics understood this challenge well. They believed that a person should regularly examine their own mind with the same seriousness that they bring to examining external events. Rather than running from discomfort, they encouraged people to investigate it. Rather than treating unpleasant emotions as enemies, they viewed them as sources of information. Socrates captured this spirit when he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." This approach requires courage because self-examination removes many of the stories people use to protect themselves. Excuses become harder to maintain. Blame becomes less convincing. What remains is a clearer view of who we are, including the habits and fears that quietly shape our lives. For many people, the fear of being alone is actually the fear of this encounter. Solitude removes convenient explanations. There is no crowd to follow and no constant stream of outside opinions to lean on. The mind becomes more visible to itself. At first, that can feel uncomfortable. Regrets that were pushed aside begin to surface. Unfinished goals demand attention. Old insecurities reappear. This is the stage where many people return to distraction because it feels easier than remaining present. Yet every escape reinforces the belief that there is something within them that must be avoided. Over time, a different relationship with solitude starts to develop. Being alone no longer feels like evidence that something is missing. It becomes an opportunity to strengthen something that was neglected for too long. The attention that was scattered across endless distractions begins to return inward. A person learns to sit with their own thoughts without immediately trying to change them. They learn to notice impulses without obeying them. They learn that peace does not come from keeping discomfort away, but from understanding it. What once felt like emptiness gradually reveals itself as unexplored space, and within that space lies the beginning of genuine self-knowledge. There is a quiet freedom hidden inside that realization. When a person no longer treats every uncomfortable feeling as a problem that must be escaped, they begin to recover a sense of authority over their own life. They stop demanding that circumstances constantly entertain them. They stop expecting other people to rescue them from boredom, uncertainty, or dissatisfaction. Instead, they develop the capacity to remain steady in their own company. That steadiness does not appear overnight. It is built through repeated moments of attention, patience, and honesty. Yet once it begins to grow, solitude loses fear because the person sitting alone is no longer a stranger. If these ideas are helping you see yourself more clearly, consider subscribing to strengthen your own. The work of self-examination is never finished, and every step toward greater awareness is a step toward greater freedom. From an early age, people are handed a story so common that it rarely attracts attention. It appears in movies, songs, advertisements, family conversations, and casual remarks that seem harmless on the surface. The message is simple. Life moves toward a particular destination, and that destination usually involves finding someone who completes the picture. Few people stop to examine this assumption because it arrives long before they develop the habit of questioning it. It becomes part of the background. Success begins to look a certain way. Fulfillment begins to look a certain way. Even happiness starts to wear a familiar face. Over time, what began as a cultural preference slowly transforms into an expectation, and expectations have a powerful influence on the way people interpret their own lives. The influence becomes visible in subtle ways. Someone achieves a personal goal, builds a career, develops skills, and creates a meaningful routine, yet still feels as though something important is missing. The feeling may not come from reality itself. It may come from the belief that fulfillment must follow a prescribed sequence. When a person measures their life against an inherited script, every deviation can feel like a deficiency. The problem is not companionship. Human connection is valuable and deeply meaningful. The problem appears when connection becomes the primary measure of worth. Once that idea takes root, being alone is no longer seen as a neutral state. It becomes something to explain, something to fix, or something to escape. This pressure rarely announces itself directly. It works quietly. Questions from relatives, comments from friends, and images presented by society all reinforce the same message. A person begins to compare themselves against a standard that was never consciously chosen. They look around and assume everyone else has discovered something they have not. The result is a constant sense of urgency. Instead of asking whether a relationship aligns with their values, they begin asking whether they are falling behind. That shift changes everything. Decisions are no longer guided by self-understanding. They are guided by fear of missing a milestone that others seem to have reached already. The search for validation grows naturally from this environment. People learn to look outward before looking inward. Compliments feel like proof of value. Attention feels like proof of significance. Acceptance feels like proof of belonging. None of these things are inherently bad. The difficulty begins when they become necessities rather than additions. A person who depends entirely on external validation lives in a fragile position because their self-image constantly shifts according to forces beyond their control. As Epictetus observed, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Praise creates confidence, criticism destroys it, approval creates peace, rejection removes it. The center of gravity no longer exists within the individual, it exists in the opinions and reactions of other people. This dynamic becomes especially powerful in relationships because relationships offer immediate emotional feedback. They provide reassurance, recognition, and a sense of importance. Yet when those experiences become the foundation of identity, they create a hidden vulnerability. The individual gradually loses contact with their own judgment. Instead of asking what they truly think, they begin asking what others think of them. Instead of asking what aligns with their principles, they ask what will preserve acceptance. At first, the compromises seem small. They often appear reasonable. Over time, however, repeated adjustments begin to shape the person's understanding of themselves. The desire to belong slowly becomes the desire to conform. The Stoics warned against this kind of dependence because they understood how easily external influences can dominate the mind. They encouraged people to examine what belongs to them and what does not. Reputation does not belong to them. Approval does not belong to them. The opinions of others do not belong to them. Character does. Judgment does. Choice does. This distinction creates a different way of living. Instead of building identity on unstable foundations, a person begins constructing it from internal principles. They stop treating outside validation as evidence of worth and start treating it as information that may or may not be useful. The difference seems small at first, yet it changes the entire relationship between the individual and the world around them. At first, the process can even feel responsible. People are taught to cooperate, adapt, and consider the needs of others. These qualities have value. No meaningful relationship can exist without them. Yet there is a difference between adapting and erasing. There is a difference between compromise and surrender. That difference becomes difficult to recognize when acceptance starts feeling more important than authenticity. A person may begin filtering their opinions before expressing them. They may avoid certain goals because those goals create tension. They may ignore instincts that once felt clear because following them could disappoint someone else. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, never value anything as profitable to yourself, which shall compel you to break your promise, to lose your self-respect. The mind becomes occupied with maintaining comfort rather than pursuing truth. What begins as a desire to preserve connection gradually turns into a habit of self-censorship. Many people respond to this feeling by searching for external solutions. They assume the problem is their job, their environment, or their circumstances. Sometimes those factors play a role. Often, however, the deeper issue lies elsewhere. The issue is not that they lack opportunities. The issue is that they have spent so much time adapting to external demands that they no longer know which desires genuinely belong to them. Their attention has been directed outward for so long that their inner voice has become difficult to hear. When that voice does speak, it often arrives as restlessness rather than clarity. It arrives as a vague awareness that something is missing without immediately revealing what that missing thing might be. The Stoics placed tremendous importance on protecting inner freedom precisely because they understood how easily it could be surrendered. They recognized that external forces are always attempting to influence judgment. Approval, criticism, praise, fear, status, and social pressure all compete for authority over the mind. The challenge is not eliminating these influences. The challenge is refusing to let them dictate who you become. A person remains free when they can engage with the world without allowing the world to define them. They remain free when their principles are stronger than their desire for approval. They remain free when they can tolerate temporary discomfort rather than betray what they know to be right. That kind of freedom is rarely tested during moments of crisis alone. More often, it is tested during ordinary days. It is tested when speaking honestly would be inconvenient. It is tested when remaining silent would be easier. It is tested when pursuing a meaningful goal requires disappointing someone else's expectations. These moments seem small, yet they reveal something important about character. Every choice teaches the mind what to value. Every repeated action strengthens a particular habit. A person who continually abandons their own judgment becomes increasingly dependent on external guidance. A person who consistently honors their principles develops a deeper sense of stability that cannot be easily shaken. Perhaps this is where many people begin recognizing their own patterns. They remember times when they ignored their instincts to gain approval. They remember goals they postponed because they feared criticism. They remember situations where they chose acceptance over honesty and later wondered why they felt disconnected from themselves. These memories are not reasons for guilt. They are opportunities for awareness. The purpose of reflection is not self-condemnation. It is understanding. Once a pattern becomes visible, it loses some of its power. What was previously automatic becomes a choice. There is a point where the effort to escape yourself becomes more exhausting than simply sitting still. Most people reach that point without realizing it. They spend years moving from distraction to distraction, convinced that the next source of stimulation will finally bring relief. Yet relief never seems to last. The mind settles for a moment and then begins searching again. Beneath that restless movement is a deeper discomfort, one that cannot be solved through constant activity because it is not asking for entertainment. It is asking for attention. This is where solitude enters the picture in a way that many people misunderstand. Solitude is often treated as a condition to avoid, something associated with absence, loneliness, or isolation. Yet being alone and feeling abandoned are not the same experience. One is a physical circumstance, the other is an interpretation. A person can feel lonely in a crowded room and content while sitting alone. The difference depends less on the presence of others and more on the relationship they have with themselves. The difficulty is that silence has a way of revealing things that noise can temporarily conceal. When the usual distractions fade, thoughts that have been pushed aside begin to return. Old regrets surface. Unresolved conflicts reappear. Questions that once seemed distant move closer. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because the mind is no longer occupied with avoiding itself. It is finally being asked to observe what has been there all along. Many people mistake this discomfort as evidence that solitude is harmful when it is often evidence that something important is being uncovered. The initial experience resembles walking into a room that has been left unattended for years. Dust has accumulated. Objects are scattered. Nothing feels organized. The instinct is to leave and close the door again. Yet the condition of the room does not improve because it is ignored. It improves because someone is willing to remain there long enough to understand what needs attention. The same principle applies internally. Avoidance delays clarity. Observation creates the possibility of change. The Stoics understood the value of creating that space. They regularly examined their thoughts, actions, and motivations because they believed that a person could not govern their life wisely without understanding their own mind. This was not an exercise in criticism, it was an exercise in honesty. They recognized that clarity emerges when a person stops running from uncomfortable truths. What seems threatening from a distance often becomes manageable once it is examined directly. The fear frequently comes from uncertainty rather than reality itself. As this process continues, solitude begins to change its character. What first appeared to be a punishment starts revealing itself as a mirror. A mirror does not create anything new. It simply reflects what is already there. The same is true of being alone. It does not invent insecurities, doubts, or fears. It exposes them. While that exposure may be uncomfortable, it is also useful because problems cannot be addressed until they are seen clearly. Awareness becomes the beginning of freedom rather than a source of suffering. Something interesting happens when a person remains with that reflection long enough. The mind gradually becomes less reactive. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer command immediate obedience. Emotions still arise, but they no longer dictate every decision. There is more space between impulse and action. That space may seem small, yet it changes everything. It allows a person to respond deliberately rather than automatically. It creates the possibility of acting according to principle instead of temporary emotion. This transformation is rarely dramatic. There is no single moment when everything suddenly makes sense. The change is quieter than that. A person notices that they no longer need constant distraction. They become more comfortable with stillness. They begin trusting their own judgment instead of seeking reassurance at every turn. Small moments of solitude that once felt unbearable start feeling restorative. The mind becomes less crowded because it is no longer fighting every uncomfortable thought that enters its awareness. Over time, a deeper sense of stability begins to emerge. External circumstances continue to change, as they always will. Some days bring success, others bring disappointment, yet the individual is no longer completely dependent on those fluctuations for a sense of balance. They have developed an inner reference point. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The silence became a source of understanding. The reflection became insight. The very experience they spent years avoiding started providing something they had been searching for elsewhere. That is the hidden power of solitude. It asks for patience before it offers clarity. It demands honesty before it provides peace. Strength is not built through endless distraction or constant validation. It is built through the willingness to remain present with oneself. When that willingness grows, the relationship with silence changes. It is no longer an empty space that needs to be filled. It becomes a place where understanding deepens, where character strengthens, and where a person slowly discovers that the presence they were seeking was their own. There comes a point when a person realizes that independence is not simply about living alone. It is not about avoiding relationships or proving that no one is needed. It is something much deeper. It is the ability to remain steady regardless of who enters or leaves your life. Many people believe they are independent because they manage their responsibilities, make their own decisions, and support themselves financially. Yet their emotional state remains tied to the reactions of others. A compliment lifts them higher than it should. A rejection wounds them more deeply than it needs to. Their circumstances appear stable, but their inner world is still being governed by forces outside their control. This is why staying single can become such a powerful period of growth. It removes many of the places where dependence likes to hide. When there is no partner constantly providing reassurance, attention, or validation, a person begins noticing how often they have relied on those things. At first, this awareness can feel uncomfortable. The mind naturally seeks familiar sources of comfort. It wants confirmation that it is appreciated, desired, understood, and important. Without those constant reminders, old insecurities sometimes rise to the surface. Yet this is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something previously hidden is finally becoming visible. Most people spend years strengthening their ability to manage external challenges while neglecting their relationship with their own emotions. They know how to solve practical problems, meet deadlines, and fulfill obligations. Yet when loneliness appears, they immediately seek escape. When uncertainty arises, they search for reassurance. When self-doubt emerges, they look for someone else to silence it. The result is a subtle form of dependency that often goes unnoticed because it feels normal. If everyone around you is doing the same thing, it rarely appears unusual. It simply becomes the accepted way of living. Solitude interrupts that pattern. Without constant emotional reinforcement from others, a person is forced to develop a different source of stability. They begin learning how to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to remove it. They learn that feelings do not always require action. They discover that anxiety can exist without controlling their choices. They realize that loneliness does not have to become desperation. As Seneca observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. These lessons cannot be fully understood through theory alone. They must be experienced directly. They emerge through repeated moments of patience and observation. Over time, emotional self-sufficiency starts to develop. This does not mean becoming cold or detached. It does not mean refusing help or rejecting connection. It means understanding that your emotional foundation belongs to you. Other people can enrich your life, support you, and share meaningful experiences with you, but they cannot become responsible for your inner balance. That responsibility remains yours. The moment a person accepts this reality, something begins to change. Relationships stop feeling like lifelines and start feeling like choices. This shift creates a different kind of freedom. When validation is no longer a necessity, the pressure to constantly earn approval begins to fade. A person becomes less concerned with managing impressions and more concerned with living honestly. They stop shaping every decision around how it will be received. They stop measuring their worth through the reactions of others. This does not happen all at once. Years of conditioning do not disappear overnight. Yet each moment of self-trust weakens the need for external confirmation. Each act of honesty strengthens the ability to stand on one's own judgment. Many people underestimate how much energy is spent seeking validation. It appears in countless small behaviors. The need to be understood by everyone. The need to avoid criticism. The need to prove value through achievements, attention, or recognition. These pursuits often seem harmless because they are so common, yet they place a person's peace in unstable hands. Approval can be given and withdrawn. Praise can be replaced by criticism. Public opinion changes constantly. Building self-worth on such shifting foundations creates a life of continual uncertainty. The Stoics offered a different perspective. They encouraged people to focus their attention on what genuinely belongs to them. Their choices belong to them. Their character belongs to them. Their actions belong to them. The opinions of others do not. Reputation does not. Outcomes do not. This distinction sounds simple, but living according to it requires discipline. It requires letting go of the illusion that external approval can provide lasting security. It requires accepting that peace comes from governing what is within your control rather than obsessing over what is not. As this understanding deepens, being single begins to feel less like an absence and more like an opportunity. The space that once seemed empty reveals its purpose. It becomes a training ground for self-respect. A place where confidence is built through action rather than applause. A place where personal values are tested without the constant influence of external expectations. The individual begins developing trust in their own judgment. They learn that uncertainty can be tolerated. They learn that discomfort can be endured. Most importantly, they learn that their sense of worth does not need to fluctuate with every change in circumstance. There is a quiet strength that emerges from this process. It is not loud. It does not seek recognition. In many ways, it is invisible to everyone except the person who possesses it. They know they can handle solitude because they have lived through it. They know they can face rejection because their identity is no longer built upon acceptance. They know they can withstand uncertainty because they have stopped demanding guarantees from life. Their confidence becomes less dependent on outcomes and more dependent on character. Ironically, this is often the point where relationships become healthier as well. A person who no longer needs validation is capable of connecting more honestly. They are less likely to tolerate disrespect out of fear of being alone. Less likely to abandon their values to preserve approval. Less likely to lose themselves inside someone else's expectations. They enter relationships not because they are incomplete, but because they are already standing on solid ground. Connection becomes an addition rather than a rescue. The deeper lesson is not that everyone should remain single forever. The lesson is that no relationship can provide what a person refuses to build within themselves. Independence is not separation from others. It is ownership of your inner life. Once that ownership is established, companionship becomes richer, choices become clearer, and peace becomes more stable. The search for constant validation begins to lose its appeal because something more reliable has taken its place. A person learns to trust their own mind, govern their own emotions, and carry their own sense of worth. That is a freedom no circumstance can easily take away. Something unexpected begins to happen when a person stops organizing their life around the expectations of others. At first, the change is subtle. Nothing dramatic announces its arrival. The same world exists. The same responsibilities remain. Yet there is more space between outside influence and personal judgment. Decisions no longer have to pass through the filter of approval before they are made. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer occupied by the constant task of managing impressions. Many people spend so much time thinking about how they are perceived that they never notice how much mental energy it consumes. Once that burden begins to lift, attention returns to where it belongs. Instead of wondering how every choice will be interpreted, a person starts asking whether that choice is actually right for them. This shift creates a level of clarity that is difficult to develop when every decision depends on external validation. Clear thinking requires distance from noise. It requires the ability to sit with an idea long enough to understand it before reacting to it. Yet modern life encourages the opposite. Opinions arrive instantly. Reactions arrive instantly. Judgments arrive instantly. People are often pushed to decide what they think before they have fully examined why they think it. Standing alone, even temporarily, interrupts that cycle. It creates room for independent thought. The mind becomes less concerned with agreement and more concerned with truth. That difference may appear small, but it changes the quality of every conclusion a person reaches. There is a reason many philosophers, writers, inventors, and thinkers throughout history deliberately sought periods of solitude. They understood that original thought rarely emerges from constant distraction. Creativity requires space, not empty space in the physical sense alone, but psychological space. Ideas need time to develop before they are exposed to the influence of others. A person who is constantly reacting to external demands often finds themselves living in a state of mental interruption. One thought is replaced by another before either has been fully explored. Solitude slows that process down. It allows curiosity to deepen rather than scatter. It allows attention to remain focused long enough for insight to emerge. The benefits extend beyond creativity. Personal growth follows a similar pattern. Growth requires observation. It requires the willingness to recognize weaknesses without becoming discouraged by them, and strengths without becoming dependent on them. When a person spends too much time seeking approval, self-understanding often becomes distorted. They begin seeing themselves through the eyes of others. Their identity becomes tied to reputation rather than reality. The danger is not criticism itself. The danger is losing the ability to evaluate yourself honestly because your attention has become dependent on external feedback. Standing alone creates an opportunity to rebuild that relationship. It encourages a person to look inward for evidence instead of outward for confirmation. This process can be uncomfortable because honest self-examination rarely produces immediate reassurance. There are habits that need to be questioned, assumptions that need to be challenged, patterns that need to be understood. Yet discomfort is often a sign that growth is taking place. The Stoics recognized this. They did not view difficulty as something that automatically needed to be avoided. They understood that many valuable qualities are developed through resistance. Patience develops when impatience is confronted. Discipline develops when distraction is resisted. Wisdom develops when simple answers are no longer accepted without examination. Growth is rarely found inside comfort alone. As a person becomes more familiar with their own mind, confidence begins to take on a different form. It is no longer based primarily on achievement, recognition, or approval. It comes from knowing that your choices are aligned with your principles. This kind of confidence is quieter than the version often celebrated by society. It does not require constant reinforcement. It does not disappear whenever circumstances become difficult. Instead, it grows stronger through consistency. Every decision made from conviction rather than pressure reinforces a sense of integrity. Every action taken because it feels right rather than because it looks impressive strengthens trust in oneself. This trust becomes increasingly important because life constantly presents opportunities to compromise. Not all compromises are harmful, many are necessary. The challenge lies in recognizing the difference between flexibility and surrender. A person who lacks a strong connection to their own values often struggles to make that distinction. They adapt so frequently to external expectations that they lose sight of what they genuinely believe. Their life becomes reactive. They move from one demand to another, adjusting constantly without asking whether the direction itself deserves their commitment. Standing alone provides a chance to interrupt that pattern. It creates an environment where decisions can be examined before they are made. Over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The desire to impress starts losing its influence. Goals become more personal. Choices become more intentional. Success becomes less about recognition and more about alignment. A person starts building a life according to what they genuinely value rather than what receives the most approval. This does not mean rejecting society or ignoring the perspectives of others. Wisdom often comes from learning from different viewpoints. The difference is that those viewpoints no longer become the ultimate authority. They become information rather than commands. The final decision remains grounded in personal judgment. There is a deep sense of freedom in that approach to life. Energy that was once spent managing perceptions becomes available for meaningful work. Attention that was once scattered across countless expectations becomes focused. The mind becomes less crowded. Ideas become clearer. Priorities become easier to identify. Progress becomes more satisfying because it is connected to authentic goals rather than borrowed ambitions. The individual is no longer trying to become the person others expect them to be. They are becoming the person they have consciously chosen to be. Perhaps this is one of the greatest advantages of learning to stand alone. It creates the conditions necessary for genuine development. Not development measured solely by achievement, status, or admiration, but development measured by understanding. A person begins to recognize what truly matters to them and what merely occupied their attention. They learn the difference between living according to conviction and living according to pressure. Once that distinction becomes clear, the direction of life begins to change. The path may not always be easier, but it becomes more honest. And there is a unique kind of peace that comes from knowing the life you are building reflects your own values rather than the expectations of everyone around you. After spending enough time alone, a surprising realization begins to emerge. The thing you once believed you were searching for was never another person. It was stability. It was clarity. It was the feeling of being at home within your own mind. For years, many people attempt to find those things through external means. They look for certainty in relationships, confidence in approval, and peace in circumstances they cannot fully control. Sometimes those experiences provide temporary comfort. They may even provide genuine happiness. Many people spend years chasing relationships because they believe happiness exists somewhere beyond their current experience. They imagine that the next connection will finally remove uncertainty, self-doubt, or loneliness. Yet even the strongest relationship cannot perform that task. It was never designed to. A relationship can offer support, companionship, understanding, and love, but it cannot permanently solve problems that originate within. The individual still brings their own fears, insecurities, habits, and beliefs into every connection they create. If those things remain unexamined, they eventually follow them wherever they go. The Stoics understood this reality with remarkable clarity. They believed that the quality of a person's life depended less on external circumstances and more on the condition of their character. This did not mean ignoring the world. It meant understanding the proper order of things. Inner stability comes first. External experiences come second. When people reverse that order, they become trapped in a constant search for something outside themselves to provide what only self-understanding can create. The search never truly ends because the source of the problem remains untouched. As this understanding deepens, the idea of being single begins to lose its emotional weight. It no longer appears as a problem that must be solved as quickly as possible. At the same time, relationships stop appearing as achievements that automatically guarantee fulfillment. Both states become neutral. Both become experiences rather than identities. The focus shifts away from relationship status and towards something more fundamental. The question is no longer whether a person is alone or partnered. The question becomes whether they are living in alignment with themselves. That shift changes the way love is understood. Love stops being a rescue mission. It stops being an escape from loneliness or uncertainty. Instead, it becomes a choice made from a position of strength. There is a profound difference between wanting someone and needing someone. Need often carries fear with it. Fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of facing life alone. Choice carries something different. It carries freedom. As Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." When a person knows they can stand on their own, connection becomes cleaner. It becomes more honest because it is no longer burdened by desperation. This is why genuine self-possession transforms relationships rather than preventing them. A person who has learned to stand alone does not enter a relationship hoping to be saved from themselves. They bring a stronger sense of responsibility into the connection. They understand that their emotional balance remains their responsibility. Their self-worth remains their responsibility. Their direction remains their responsibility. Instead of asking another person to carry those burdens, they carry them themselves. The relationship becomes a place where two individuals share their lives, not a place where one person attempts to become the missing piece of another. There is also a quiet confidence that develops through this process, not the confidence that comes from success or recognition, but the confidence that comes from experience. You learn that difficult emotions can be endured. You learn that uncertainty does not destroy you. You learn that loneliness passes, rejection passes, disappointment passes. Most importantly, you learn that your value does not disappear when circumstances become uncomfortable. This knowledge changes the way you move through the world. Fear loses some of its influence because you have already faced many of the things you once tried to avoid. The ancient Stoics often returned to the idea of freedom because they recognized how easily people surrender it. Sometimes they surrender it to possessions, sometimes to status, sometimes to public opinion, sometimes to relationships. Yet freedom remains impossible whenever your peace depends entirely on something outside your control. The more dependent you become on external conditions, the more fragile your stability becomes. The more ownership you take over your own mind, the stronger that stability grows. Freedom is not the absence of connection, it is the absence of dependence. Eventually, a person arrives at a realization that feels both simple and profound. Being single was never the goal. Remaining alone forever was never the goal. The goal was becoming whole. The goal was developing enough self-understanding that your life no longer revolves around escaping yourself. Once that happens, everything changes. Solitude becomes valuable rather than frightening. Relationships become meaningful rather than necessary. Choices become clearer because they are guided by principles instead of pressure. And perhaps that is the greatest reward hidden within this journey. You stop searching for someone to complete your life and start building a life that already feels complete. From that place, love becomes a gift rather than a requirement. Connection becomes an addition rather than a solution. You belong to yourself first, and because of that, you can finally share yourself freely. That is true self-possession. That is true freedom. And once it is discovered, it becomes one of the few things the world cannot take away. The world will continue telling you that fulfillment is somewhere outside of you, that peace is waiting in the next achievement, the next relationship, or the next chapter of your life. But the strongest foundation you will ever build is the one that exists within. The moment you stop running from yourself and start standing firmly in your own company, everything changes. You no longer seek completeness. You realize it was there all along. If this message resonated with you, don't stop here. One of the videos on your screen right now will take this journey even deeper and help you strengthen the mindset, discipline, and inner freedom that few people ever develop. Choose the one that speaks to you most and continue the path. And thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal, where every step inward is a step closer to becoming who you were meant to be.